In this video, we're going to build this e-commerce site using NextJs 13 app directory and React Server components. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Hamid. I'm a full stack web developer, and here on this channel, we talk about modern web dev topics like React and NextJs. So let's go. We're going to use Swell to manage our products and power our e-commerce backend. And if you're not familiar with Swell, I have another video on the channel where I dive a bit deeper into what Swell is and its features. But basically, Swell is a headless e-commerce that allows you to manage your products. It comes built in with features like subscriptions and integrations like payment gateways, Stripe, and other integrations that you would need to run an e-commerce store. And it is headless, meaning that it's not connected necessarily to any front end, any site, and it exposes all the functionality of an e-commerce via the API that it has, and you can just connect it to any store that you have. In this case, we're going to build our front end store with NextJs and connect it to Swell, which is kind of our backend. And we're going to do all this in NextJs 13 app directory, meaning that all the data fetching is going to happen, or some of the data fetching is going to happen on the server inside of our React Server components, and some of them which requires user interactivity, for example, where a user is adding maybe a product to a cart, is happening on the client side, and then we're going to tie these two together. Now, to get started, I have created a Next.js app by running npx create next app, and I have turned the experimental flag for app on so that we're working with the app directory. Again, the app directory is not stable yet or at the time of this recording, but we're trying to kind of learn where Next.js or React in general is headed with the React Server components, and that's why we are creating this project in the app directory. Now, I have already built this project, but I'm going to explain every step of the way what I have done and what you need to be doing to kind of replicate what I have built here. I'm going to also include a link for the source code so you can follow along. Now, to get started, I'm just going to mention that this project is set up with Tailwind, as most of my projects are. So it's set up with Tailwind. You can just copy the config that I have already and go from there. So when we wanted to start in the app directory, we're dealing with pages and layouts as the main shell of our application, and then we're going to dive deeper into nested layouts or nested segments or paths. So let's get started with our root layout. This is what comes out of the box when you're creating a new Next.js app. And all there is here, let me just close this off, is this is kind of a representation of our HTML document where we have the HTML tag, we have the body, and as you can see here, I have included a header, a footer, and a main tag to include any children, and these children are going to be any nested route or page that will be then plugged in here in this root layout. Now, I'm using the Next font over here. As you can see, I'm using the Inter font from Next font. This is a new feature that's now included as part of the Next package. Again, if you don't know about it, there is a video on the channel where I dive deeper into this Next font and how you can use it. But basically, you get these functions from these local fonts, and then you use this class name on that font to kind of set a class name on your HTML, and this turns the font on the whole site into whatever font that you're using. Now here, Inter is a variable font, so I didn't need to define different sizes or different weights, but you can pretty much use any Google fonts or any custom font that you have local in your project. This helps to locally host your fonts, which then reduces cumulative layout shift when the fonts are swapping on your users' devices, which increases the performance or your Web Vital score. Now, the metadata again is the new metadata API in 13.2. Again, I mentioned metadata in that same video or a separate video. I'll link it in the description, where you don't need any longer to have a separate head component here. You can just add in any metadata that you want to this or any other page, and these metadata objects are going to merge together to create the final metadata for whatever page it is that you're showing. So this is the root layout, and just a quick note on global CSS. This is what we are writing all of our CSS on, and right now I'm just using Tailwind directives to reset the browser native stylings and just sets this custom base layer class on the content of our Next.js application. If you're not familiar with adding Tailwind to your project, you can just go to the documentation on the site, and on the installation you can go to framework guides, go to Next.js, and you can follow this instruction, and you should be able to install Tailwind in your project. So next thing from the layout would be our homepage. So on the homepage, as you can see here, before I get to the homepage, let me just quickly show the header and the footer, and then we will get to the homepage. So on the header component, what we're doing over here, we're talking about that header component up there. It's just a header tag. We have some navigation, this cafe logo, and then some links that goes to the product page. So it opens up a product page. And then at the end of it, we have this button that shows the shopping cart, and it also fetches our carts from Swell backend to show any items if we have in our cart. Now, I'm going to get into this a little bit later, but for now, just remember that we're just having this higher level header navigation links up there. We're going to dive deeper into this functionality and what each of these guys are doing a bit later. But basically, we have this shopping cart, which just opens this slider that shows if we have any items in our cart. So for example, if I go ahead and add this to our cart, we can see that number of items there updated, and we can see that item now in our cart. We can remove it from our cart, and we can close that off. So that's that functionality. We're going to talk about how we implement that using the React Server components, and also this part, which is kind of interacting with the user, so it needs some client-side interactivity, and how I'm actually tying these two together to kind of be seamless. Some of the data, as I mentioned, is coming from the backend. Some of the interactivity is coming from the front end, and we're going to look at that in details. Now, the footer is very simple. So we have some footer, some information over here. You can head out to my site. There's a link there. And I have a couple of notes there about actually Swell and other technology that you can use in Next.js. And then there's also a link to Swell from down there if you wanted to. Okay, so that was the footer component. So pretty simple. Let's go to the home page and see what's going on there. So let me just close this off. So our home page, what we're doing here, nothing crazy. It's just this section with this background image and a couple of links that goes to the products. So I didn't want it to be a plain like homepage. Just added it here. Has nothing to do with app directory or anything. It's just a regular component, even though it's a React Server component, because by default, any component that you put inside of the app directory is going to be a React Server component, unless you specify up top that you want it to be a client component by that directive. So if you specify use client, it will be a client component. Otherwise, it will be a React Server component, meaning that the content of the page, the data fetching, anything that happens on the server, and the user just gets an HTML, and no JavaScript is needed to run that page. If you're not familiar with the app directory or Next.js 13, I have a playlist or a bunch of videos talking about the Next.js 13. There's an introduction video, and then we dive deeper. We add authentication to it. So again, I'll link it somewhere in the cart and the descriptions. You can follow along there to understand this new mental model in React applications and React Server components, and then come back here or do it in parallel to understand what it is if you're not familiar with the app directory. So as you can see here, the homepage wasn't that big of a deal. Next, let's just go to the products. So on the products, which is this folder here, and inside of it, I have this page.jsx, which points to the index of that segment. So if we go to /products, if you can see up there, this page .jsx is responsible to render that page. Inside of it, we have the dynamic slug segment, and inside of it, there is another page, which again represents the index route at that slug, which we're going to see next. But let's just start from this product page. So we'll just close this off and close that off. Okay, so here what we're doing is we are calling this get products function to get our products and then pass it as a prop to this products component, which is literally a grid of these products over here. So what's happening over here that's worth noting is actually fetching our data inside of our page, which is a React component at the end of the day. And this is one of the features of React Server components. You can turn them into an async function and fetch your data directly inside of your component. This is something that you would have done in get server-side props or get static props in the previous versions of Next.js. But with React Server components, you can just fetch data directly inside your React component, in this case, the product page. Now, let's quickly look at this get products inside of our library. So to connect to Swell as our backend and be able to fetch our products, fetch the cart or add items and remove items from the cart, I've created this lib directory, and inside of it, there is this Swell. There is a client file over here, which gets this Swell from Swell.js. And then with passing some environment variables for our store ID and our public key, it creates a Swell client that we can then use to fetch our products. So that's the client part. And let's go to products. For example, I've organized the functions that we have into these files. So whatever function we have for working with the cart object inside of our Swell store is in the cart.js file, and all of the functions that we need to work with our products from our Swell store is inside the product.js. So the get products, as you can see here, is a function we have here. It uses swell.products.list and lists our products. Okay, and then we have another function here, get product by slug, which you pass a slug or ID and then gets that specific product. Okay, so from inside of our page, we're calling this get products, and this is returning our products, and we're passing these products down to this products component, which what it does, it just shows them in a list or in a grid. Each of these items are now a link, as you can see here, using the next link that point to /products and dynamically to that slug. So when we click on one of these guys, it goes to products and then / that slug. So let's actually see how we are rendering that page. We just close this off. So inside of the app, inside of the products, we're going to slug and then the page. And here, as you can see, I'm calling that get product by slug, and I'm getting this dynamic segment of our slug from the params object that's passed to my page component to fetch that specific product using this function that we just see inside of our Swell library. And once I get the product, I now pass it into the product component as a prop. Now let's look at what product component is. Now product component needs some interactivity. The user is going to click on this button to add this to their cart. So we are using a client component because we're going to be using with some state inside of this component. Now, anytime you need to add state or React hooks in your components, they need to be a client component that you can define with this use client. Now, what we're doing over here is that we're rendering the content of the product that's coming. That's not a big deal at this point. But what's interesting, or what's again worth noting, is when you hit add to cart, there is a form over here that you would submit, and this is going to call this handle submit function. And this handle submit function is actually using a new way of sending data to your backend or mutating data in your backend. If you remember, usually in Next.js 12, we would have API endpoints for handling form submission. So anytime we want to change our data on the server in our database, if you write an API endpoint for it, we'll then from our forms, once they're submitted, hit those API endpoints. Now, this is not quite the mental model that you need to have with React Server Components or this new way of creating your Next.js apps. For mutation, you need to use mutation. So if you go to the new documentation from Next.js and search for mutation, let me just disable this commenting on this session. As you can see here, the Next.js team is working on a new RFC for mutating data. And basically, for now, when you're mutating data, you have to call refresh on your router to kind of refresh or refetch that route or segment to get the new updated data from your server using the use transition hook. So there is an example here. You can see inside of our React Server component or page, we are fetching some to-dos. We are rendering a list of our to-dos. And then, for example, we want to have the user be able to mark these to-do items as complete. So inside of our client component for this to-do component, which needs client interactivity because they need to click on it, we need a state. We're using a client component, and then we're using this use transition hook from React. And as you can see down here, we are rendering an input checkbox for the user to click on, and we're handling the change in this function. We have a local state for loading, so we're setting the loading. We are actually making that fetch request to update this specific to-do, mark it as complete. And once we're done, we're going to use this set transition function that we got back from this use transition hook we got from React. And inside of it, we're going to call the refresh on our router, which then refreshes this route segment and anything nested inside of it from the server to get the updated data. Going back to our product component, if I close this up, as you can see over here, let me just go back to this page. As you can see over here in this handle submit that we had in the form, we are preventing the default first. We are setting a local loading state. Again, for this to work, we are using a client component. And then we are calling this add to cart function. We're going to look at it in a second, but this is like fetching and updating our cart inside of our Swell backend. Once it's done, we set the loading to false. And then we call this start transition, which then calls the refresh on the router, which then refetches this React Server component from the server with the updated data. Now I have this mutate cart over here. You can ignore it for now. Has nothing to do with the flow that I just explained in mutating data. This is actually for SWR, and it is giving me the cart on the client side. We're going to come back to this later on, but for now, what we want to focus on is handling this form submission from inside of a client component that's inside of a page component that was a React Server component, and we're using this new way of mutating data instead of submitting our form to an API endpoint. So once we submit this or click on this, is going to disable this button, and for that I'm using this is mutating state, which is looking to see if you're loading or not. This is the state that we were setting before we actually do that change. And it's also using this is pending coming from the transition. So either when we're loading or when we're pending this transition, we're going to set the is mutating to true. And then down in that bottom in the form that I just showed, if we're going to disable that button when we're mutating so the user cannot click like multiple times, or if we wanted to style it differently, we're showing this loading spinner and we're going to disallow them to click on it. Now let's quickly look at this add to cart function that we have here. Again, all of our cart functionality is inside of this cart.js. So add to cart is going to use our Swell client, as you can see up there, is going to call the add item on it and pass an item to it. You can go ahead and check out Swell docs. So there is a backend API This is actually not the package we're using. There's two packages when working with Swell. There's Swell Node, which is primarily and only for backend, and there's this front-end API, which is Swell JS, which here in this instance works on the client and the server. So you can here, for example, go to cart and see how you can retrieve a cart or add items to a cart, update your cart or update the item, remove an item, so forth and so on. And I've included some functions here, such as adding the cart, removing from the cart, updating quantity, emptying the cart completely, or just getting the instance of the cart that's attached to the current session. Now, the way this front end or the Swell JS works is on the client side, it is creating this session and attaching the cart information that's created in your backend to this session. So let me just quickly show you there. Let me just close this off and close that off. So as you can see, I have two items here in my cart. If I go to my Swell dashboard, under the orders, I can see these carts. And I think that last one probably should be the one that we're working on now, or maybe not. Maybe I have a different one because I'm actually running. Okay, it's this one. So as you can see here, it's holding this cart, even though I'm not logged into the system, but it's tracking this session on the client side and attaching this cart instance to this session. So whenever we're refreshing the page or changing pages, that session and that cart stays the same, and we can fetch updates anytime that we want. Okay, let's go back to our components over here. So we talked about the product page and the slug page over here. And as you can see, our pages and home pages are done. Inside of our components, we have this products and product component that we worked on. On the UI, we have this loading spinners on our buttons. And in the layout, we had the header and the footer. So the only thing remaining for us is this cart slider, which is this sliding that comes in and shows the content of the cart. And it also adds this functionality for you to remove the item from the cart or go to the checkout. Okay, let's go back to our header and see how we are taking care of the functionality of this cart slider here and actually updating this items and the cart on the client side. So let me close this off so that we can have more room over here. As you remember, we talked about the header in the beginning of the video. And other than this links and navigations that we had this button over here, which is that shopping cart button that changes some internal state, which is cart slider is open or not. So we want to track to see if the slider is open or not. So we have this local state over in our header. Therefore, we need to use a client component for the header. And then if it's open, we're actually rendering this cart slider. So I'm going to actually show that too. This is a slider component from Tailwind Components. Again, if you go to Tailwind, there's this component section, which are pre-made components you can use. It's amazing. You can check it out. But basically, we are using that slider component for our shopping cart. But what's interesting over here, now just to quickly show what the cart slider is doing, is rendering this component over here that transitions. So there's some animations on the cart, as you can see. And inside of it, what we're basically doing is that we are showing the content of our cart. But where are we getting the content of our cart to be passed to this? That's the important question over here. So the cart instance or the cart object is being sent to this from the header component. So when we are rendering this cart slider, we are sending in the cart, we are sending if we're loading the cart or not, if this cart slider should be open or not. So we're sending this down to this cart slider. We're going to talk about what happens here in the remove item and what we're doing there in a second. But before that, let's just actually see how we are getting this cart instance. Now, to get this cart instance, we are using SWR, which is a library actually from NextJs team. That's for managing data fetching on the client side. And the way it works is that you would use this use SWR hook from the package, as you can see up there. You'll pass it a key or an endpoint and a fetcher function. In this case, I'm just using the get cart function that we have defined before. And basically what this does, it uses the Swell client and calls the get method on the cart. This is actually going to get you the instance of the card that's attached to the current session. Because this is a front-end API in Swell, it's actually giving you this card that's attached to the session. Now, this is worth noting if you're using Swell backend API versus front-end API, because there's two different packages you can work, or two different APIs you can work on. The front-end API is a subset of the backend API. Now, in the backend API, if you're trying to retrieve a cart, you need to pass it the ID of the cart you're trying to retrieve, because the backend API or on the server, you don't have access to client-side sessions, and we are not passing the sessions backend, or we are not managing our sessions in the backend. So if you're working with the backend API, if you try to retrieve the card, it won't retrieve anything unless you pass it an ID. Whereas if on the front end, you are trying to retrieve a card, if you just call the get method, if you could see over here on the card object, it's going to give you the card that's attached to the current session. And that's what we're doing here inside of our component. So in this get card, I'm using this function that gives me the current card for the current session, for the current user. And I'm managing it with this SWR hook as this cart. And I'm just seeing to see if there's any item quantity there. And if there is, let me just close this off. If there is, I'm showing the item quantity in the current cart up there. Now let's actually see what's happening in this cart slider. As I mentioned before, this is a Tailwind component that shows that slider. But what's important here is that we are sending the cart object or instance to this slider now. And we can show the content of the cart, the products that we have inside of it. And what we want to do is to add the functionality to be able to remove these items from the cart. Now, as you can see here down, I have for every item this remove button that calls this remove item function. And up here, we're defining this function. And I'm using the same approach or the same mental model for mutating, because again, we are now mutating our backend or data. And instead of writing an API endpoint, which then upon this form submission, on click of this button, we're going to hit that endpoint. We're going to use this new mutation kind of API from NextJs, where we would just call those functions inside of our async handlers. We're going to manage some local state, and then we're going to use this transition hook from React to refresh our page once the mutation has finished, to refetch all this data from that root layout segment down in all nested pages to get the updated data for now before that mutation API is stable, and we know then how the way of mutating data would be. But for now, we're just using router.refresh. Now again, I'm calling this mutate cart on this remove item, similar to what I was doing inside of our pages when we were adding these items. And this mutate comes from SWR. And basically, if I go back to the SWR hook to show you this, what you can do when you're using SWR, if I make this a bit bigger, is that in the docs, you could see there's this mutation and revalidation. So not only SWR can help you fetch your data and manages the pending, the loading, the error state for fetching the data, but you can also use it to mutate or change it or send a put post request, or simply you can just revalidate the data. And that's what I'm doing in this instance, because I'm not using SWR to change the data. I'm using this use transition API that I just explained to do this change here, to remove the item from the cart. Remove the item from the cart is just a function we have here inside of our Swell library that just goes ahead and removes a specific item from our cart. But what we're doing here after this mutation has happened in our backend, we are just refreshing or reloading this component so we get the new data from our server. But I also want to refresh or revalidate the data that SWR is managing for me on the client side, because this component that I have here is actually a client-side component because it needs this interactivity for me to be able to click on it. So I need to get this data and hold it somewhere. Now, you can use in the previous version of this app that we built in NextJs pages directory, I had a context for my cart. So anytime that we would make any changes to the Swell API, to our cart, to our products, we would also update our context, and that context for our cart was providing the cart object to all of our applications, so you could hook into that cart, add items to it, remove items to it, and know what's the quantity there. But we're not using a context over here, because as soon as you put in a context for your whole kind of layout, it turns them into client components. So you no longer can use React Server components because they do not support context. Context is a hook, and for a hook, you need client components. So basically, if you just wrap your whole layout or root layout with a context provider, you're basically turning your whole application into a client component and dismissing the whole React Server component or this new concept. And quite frankly, you don't even need to do that, because your React Server components kind of work like an API endpoint, because you can fetch data inside of them and then send them as props to your components. So if you are fetching data in your root layout, that kind of works as your context API to provide data to lower down components. And if a mutation happens, and if you want to manage some state on the client side, you can use something like SWR to kind of fetch that updated data or that mutated data and revalidate yourself with that resource that you are updating through React Server components. Now, to see this in action, we can actually go to our products page and maybe visit one of these coffees we have and hit add to cart. And then we can see this goes ahead to add this to our current cart via the backend. And once this is done, we can see that shopping cart also updated there. We can then remove items from here and update our cart, which then mutates this data that we have or we're managing with SWR. Now, this may not be the only way to do it. This is what I could come up with to kind of tie in our front end and back end together. We are managing everything as much as we can in our React Server components. We're fetching the data on the server. We are changing the data on the server. But when we need some client-side interactivity and state, we are using SWR to also hook to that same resource and revalidate it when needed. That's a wrap for this video, folks. If you have any questions or suggestions, hit me up in the comments. If you learned anything from this video, please give it a like. I'm planning to add more features to this base e-commerce solution we built together. So make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss when I drop new videos. You might also be interested in my NextJs course. There's a link in the description. You can check it out, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.